Welcome, adventurers. Today on Rebel Then King, we are continuing to talk about combat tactics in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. I already had one video to start this series where we went over the combat basics, the guidelines you should always have in every single combat encounter. Then I went over what to do in round number 1, so naturally this is going to be what to do in round number 2. Before we dive in, I want to take a minute to ask you to subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so already. I'm coming up on about 2 years and I'm going to celebrate with a video of my new favorite hobby, which is tangentially related to Pathfinder 2nd Edition, throwing knives. I hope you'll enjoy it. I also am starting up a Twitch channel over at twitch.tv/RebelThenKing. I'm going to have a debut stream on March 27th to celebrate the 2-year anniversary of this channel. We're going to look back at my videos, look back at the system, how much it's changed because, player cores and remasters and just tons of stuff over the last 2 years to recap. See you then, and now back to round number 2. Now, if you had a great first round number 2 should be pretty easy, but that usually won't be the case, and there are lots of things you need to consider in the second round of combat. As always, let's start by talking about what not to do. We'll start with your cleric. They decide that your injured fighter is going to be just fine. So they stay put, they cast a cantrip, which of course misses due to cover. Then they decide to move into melee range for some reason. Great place for a cleric to be. Next up, your thaumaturge. They decide that they've had enough of their current sparring partner, so they move over to a new enemy and exploit vulnerability there, and sure, that goes well. And they strike and hit, but that creature was previously at full hit points, so it is still left standing. Now for your bard, who stands toe-to-toe with an enemy. They cast Haunting Him, which of course provokes a reactive strike. And also Haunting Him hits some of their allies. Oh, and then they remember that they're a bard, so they use Courageous Anthem after their damage rolls, not before. Next, we have a champion who fails to activate their potency crystal that they have sitting around, and they swing and miss, and swing and miss, and they go for it, and they swing and miss again. And now that injured fighter is up. They strike and miss somehow. I don't know how a fighter does that, but it does happen. Fighters can miss. Then they trip, which does work, thankfully. And then they strike again, but miss due to the huge multiple attack penalty. And now the enemies go and, they murder your injured fighter who wasn't healed and didn't take any defensive actions. They take multiple attacks against your bard, your thaumaturge, and your cleric. Yikes. So that round was a failure in multiple ways. Failing to heal your fighter and that fighter failing to take any defensive actions resulted in a dying fighter. Not finishing weakened opponents before moving on to other ones resulted in half a dozen or so extra strikes that you would not have faced otherwise. Failing to take an action to reposition meant that the bard took damage from a reaction and then did damage to some of their own allies with that area of effect. And then the cleric, missing and not healing and moving into melee range, it was just terrible all around. So what do you want to do instead in round number 2? Well, round number 2 can be pretty simple if you've watched my previous videos, because it's basically a repeat of round number 1. After a very crucial resetting period and with some slightly adjusted priorities along the way. The things that I think you need to do in priority in round number 2 are: priority number 1, heal. Heal people before they go down to the dying condition. That is such a loss of actions. Even if you do heal someone after they were dying, they are now wounded, which is a terrible condition. So proactively heal as your first priority in round number 2. The second priority is reposition. Now, I did not include positioning per se in my round number 1 video that was kind of implied at times. I also figured that in round number 1, you kind of have a little bit of pre-combat positioning based on how you enter a room or some maybe setup actions before you roll initiative. But after you have a round of the enemy closing in and engaging with you, things can get pretty wacky, so you will need to reposition. You might need to reposition to avoid obstructed ranged spell attacks or weapon attacks, clusters of allies and enemies in the same spot interfering with your area of effect damage, provoking reactions, as we saw. So make sure to take a step back before casting spells in round number 2. Priority number 3 is a familiar one now, and that is knowledge. Now, I would say this is still a high priority, though it is something you will often skip in round number 2 because you probably succeeded at least at one recall knowledge in round number 1, or figured out what is going on by the way the enemies attacked you, or the way that some of your attacks didn't work against the enemy. But not always, and you might be very desperate for more information after a first round that did not go as planned. So again, just like in round number 1, figure out what is going on and then adjust the rest of your game plan accordingly. And now we are really into the repeats. Priority number 4, buffing. Buffing tends to be automatic, no rolls needed, it just works. Level up your party before engaging. And this is followed by priority number 5, just like last time, debuffing. This is a slightly lesser priority to me because it's not automatic, and that is actually especially true in round number 2, because there are some common debuffing tactics like demoralizing, where the target is immune after an initial attempt to demoralize them. So you might find yourself with fewer debuffing actions available to you in round number 2. Now, number 6 is a new priority just for round number 2, finishers. And I don't just mean swashbucklers here, though I definitely do mean swashbucklers finishers. This is the time to follow the guidelines in my initial video and clear things from the battlefield. This could mean finding a creature who is very injured and doing an attack that has a high likelihood of doing some damage. So the swashbucklers finishers, for example, that do damage even on a miss, or an alchemical bomb that will deal splash damage even on a miss, or a spell that targets a save so that even if the creature succeeds at the save, some damage is still dealt. This could also mean a creature who is injured but not severely injured, and you want to lay in one really strong attack to take them down. That could, again, be a swashbuckler's finisher, though it could also be something like Vicious Swing. The point is, you want to clear the injured enemies as fast as you possibly can, and round number 2 is where that becomes vitally important. And now we're moving down in priority order and continuing to repeat some things from round number 1. Priority number 7 is area of effect, I'm going to say / multiple target damage. It's now a little more unlikely that you can use a big area of effect cleanly without injuring an ally, but if you can, and you can't contribute in any of the other ways listed above, or those things are already done, go for it. The other thing to keep in mind is this is a great time for multiple target, but not necessarily area of effect. Electric Arc comes to mind, also the Kineticist Magnetic Pinions, Blazing Bolt is a spell that also comes to mind. The things that you attack multiple creatures at range without needing to target an area. Round number 2 is a great time to use that because you can still hit multiple targets, even if they are now mixing up with your allies. I'm going to speed things along and say number 8 and 9 together are big ticket items just like last time. Round number 2 is still a decent time to use these, even though they might not have as much impact. But then again, sometimes at the start of round number 2, there is still a completely untouched creature or two on the battlefield who can deal a lot of damage to you. So this is still a good time to use a big ticket item. And then number 9, also a bit less important, but persistent damage. Obviously, if the combat only makes it to the end of round 2, well, then that persistent damage wasn't helpful. But again, if there are some relatively untouched creatures out there and you can expect multiple rounds of combat after round number 2, persistent damage is definitely a good thing to get in. And then finally, rounding everything out, priorities 10, 11, and 12. Range damage, stay safe, do what you can. Melee damage, Wrecking Crew, get in there and wreck them. And then 10, just like last time, defense. Shields, battlefield control, simple movement, taking cover, those types of things. Set yourself up to make it to round 3 in case you need to. Okay, so to recap all of the things that you should do in round number 2 in priority order. Priority number 1, heal. Number 2, reposition. Priority number 3, knowledge, maybe. Number 4, buff. Number 5, debuff. And number 6, finishers, clear things from the battlefield. At priority number 7, we have area of effect / multiple target. At number 8, big ticket items. Priority number 9, persistent damage. Number 10, range damage. 11, melee damage. And finally, 12, defenses. So now let's give that first squad a redo and give them a good round number 2. Starting again with the cleric. Your cleric is up. They reposition to have an open line of sight for the next round, setting themselves up. That's a reposition. Now they cast a 2-action heal on their fighter. That's healing. Now the thaumaturge, they're going to stay put. They'll demoralize the enemy they're already engaged with. That's a debuff. Exploit vulnerability if they haven't already. That is a buff. And then they make a strike. Bam, 1 dead enemy, which kind of counts as a finisher with that big buff that they use from exploit vulnerability. Now for your bard, who no longer stands toe-to-toe with an enemy. Now, they don't need to reposition, and they cast Courageous Anthem. That's a buff. Then they cast Haunting Hymn, hitting multiple enemies with bonus damage from Courageous Anthem, targeting saves, and killing another enemy. So that's area of effect, and it's a finisher because it is a spell that targets a save and did some damage to a creature that already was pretty injured. Now it is time for the champion, who remembers to activate their potency crystal, which is a big ticket item. They land a big strike and they raise their shield, defenses. And now that barely injured fighter is up, they trip first. That's a debuff. They now strike successfully and they also raise a shield, more defenses. And now the enemies are up and, well, there are 2 fewer of them. And they have to take stride actions or stand up in order to reach most of you. And they also have to deal with multiple raised shields in order to do any damage. That is a much, much better second round. And that's it. If you've understood the basics and executed an excellent round 1, round 2 should feel pretty automatic. It's more or less of a repeat of round number 1, after that initial heal and reset and readjust period. And also with more emphasis on taking out opportune targets and a little bit less emphasis on just doing as much damage as you can. You will notice it is going to be a lot harder to execute on the full priority list and put it in the exact order this time. But hey, that's okay because we don't just want to have to do the same thing every single time. It's more fun when there is variety in our combat. Anything else that we're missing, though? Any disagreements about the priorities listed? Let's talk about that in the comments. And until then, remember that rounds number 1 and 2 can feel great while you still have cohesion and have all of your resources. But round number 3 is what separates the players who will be leveling up from those who will be creating new characters.